Hey guys, it's me, cyoubx. Today we're gonna have a little chat. This is the GuHong version 4. It's a really good cube, and for $15, it's one of the better purchases you can make in 2020 if you're looking to add to your collection. This video is not going to be a full review of this cube. Instead, we're going to talk specifically about magnets and the strength of turning and why it's actually kind of a complicated thing to measure. So from the videos that I've seen about this cube, as well as some comments that I've read on forums and other things, it seems like people can't really agree if the GuHong version 4 has weak magnets or strong magnets. And because this cube has no magnetic adjustment system, that actually really matters, because if you get a cube with magnets that are really strong, you're kind of out of luck. Whereas if the magnets are weak, maybe you can attach extra magnets or something. But in any case, people want to know how strong the magnets are in this cube. As a scientist and engineer, I feel like this is such a silly thing to argue about, because clearly, if we're talking about the strength or the amount of force required to move something, there's got to be an objective measure. This should not be a hand-wavy, guess and check kind of thing. It should be an objective measure, just like we measure how heavy a cube is or what the size of the cube is. So why don't we just do that? Well, it turns out I also do not have the tools to measure the force required to turn this cube. But what I do have is a 3D printer and a brain. So I was thinking to myself how I could actually build something to measure the force required to turn this cube using the stuff that I have. And of course, I could try to buy some sort of force sensor or other thing, but it wouldn't get delivered until after Christmas, and then, well, this video would be pointless. Stay until the end so you know why. So I looked around my desk, and the only tool with any sort of precision that I had was calipers. So the thought was to see if I could transform what usually measures distance into something that measures force, or at least relative force. So I ended up making this thing. It works by relying on the material properties of the actual plastic. So all hard materials, regardless of how stiff they are, have some sort of elasticity to them, meaning there's some springiness in the material. This includes really flimsy things like paper as well. In general, if I take a flat piece of material, I can measure how far it bends before something moves or gives in order to see how much force is required in somewhat arbitrary units. So for example, if I have a cord dangling in midair and I want to know how much force is required or how much displacement in the paper is required in order to move this cable, I can simply push on it with the piece of paper and measure the deflection at where I'm holding it. So in this example, you can see that the paper does bend, but not a whole lot. In contrast, let's say I want to move my finger with this piece of paper, it's going to deflect a lot more, right? Same concept here. If I put a cube in this little caddy and I squeeze right here, if the cube is really hard to turn, you can see that the plastic starts deflecting. It starts bending. At some point, this force applied right here is going to transfer to this paddle, and it will ultimately turn the cube. If I can measure the amount that this is pushed in, that gives me some value of the force required. And of course, the larger the number, the more force required in order to turn that layer. So let's go take some measurements. So we'll start with the GaN 11 Pro. This is on the strongest magnet settings for both the edge corner and the corner core magnets. So I believe this is the strongest magnetic cube that I own. So we'll start this test using this cube. The calipers are zeroed in this position. It's really hard to see without the cube falling off. So what I'm going to do is just measure like this, and you'll have to take my word for it when I read off the measurements. So we are at -5 right now. Still no turns. Oh, okay. So that was -5.5 is when the cube turned. We're going to try the Meilong 3M. So I consider this cube to have moderate magnet settings. So we'll see if it is less than -5.3. So we're at -1.5, -1.6, -1.7. Okay, we just reached 2 millimeters. There it is. So that was 4.7. And finally, the GuHong V4. All right, so we are at -2, -3. Oh, okay. Yeah, that was around 3.5. I'll do it again. -1. It's already about to move. We're at -2. There it is. 3.6. Okay, so as I suspected, the GaN 11 Pro, of the three that I tested, did have the strongest magnets. And it should. This cube literally has adjustable magnets, and I put them on the strongest setting. It makes sense that it required more force on these calipers to turn this cube than, say, a Meilong 3M, which people agree generally has moderate strength magnets. Off camera, I actually measured each cube 5 more times just to make sure that I wasn't missing something. The deflections were remarkably consistent. The differences between measurements of the same cube were around 100 to 200 microns, which is far smaller than the actual difference between cubes. So now, we objectively know the truth. The GuHong version 4 has weak magnets, even compared to the Meilong 3M. So then, why is there any question about whether or not these magnets are strong or weak? It turns out, the measurements are a little bit more complicated than just measuring how much force is required. Let's say I had a non-magnetic cube that just didn't turn very well, like an old Rubik's store-bought or even the original Rubik's Cube. The amount of force required would be immense, and eventually the layer would turn. But the measurements on the calipers might say that it was like a 7mm deflection. But we know that that cube doesn't have any magnets, so what are we really measuring here? So essentially what we measured is not the strength of the magnets specifically, but how much force is required in order to turn the cube. Now, given these are all lubed the same and tensioned relatively similar, it's an okay measure because they are all magnetic cubes. But I think the perception of how strong the magnets are in a cube is actually not based on how much force is required to just simply move the layer, but it's actually the difference between starting the move at an aligned position versus something at 45 degrees. For example, on the GaN 11 Pro, even though the magnets are very, very strong, when you're actually turning the cube, it feels more subtle, and that's because there's magnets in the core as well. On the Meilong 3M, the layers are actually a little bit stiffer than the 11 Pro anyway. It's a slower cube. So even when the magnets are not touching each other, there's still going to be some force required to turn the cube. On the GuHong V4, even though the magnets are weaker and it is easier to start a turn, it's even easier to turn the cube once the magnets are not engaged. This cube is just really fast, and when the magnets are not aligned, it actually just feels like nothing. Like this cube turns effortlessly. And so I think the confusion comes from two different measurements. I think some people focus a lot on how much force is actually required to misalign the layer, which is the measurement that I took in this video. And indeed, the GuHong version 4 has weak magnets based on those measurements. But I think other people are actually subconsciously, or maybe consciously, thinking about the difference between when the layers are aligned versus when they're not aligned. And in that case, the GuHong version 4 does feel like it has stronger magnets because the difference between this and this is immense compared to the other cubes I tested. So, does the GuHong version 4 have weak or strong magnets? It depends. If you're someone who has really fast turning, then you're not going to be spending a lot of time in this region, and you're just going to spend more time with the magnets aligned. In which case, I would say the cube has weak magnets because you're only going to feel the clicks, and those clicks are actually pretty subtle compared to the other cubes. If you're someone who turns really slowly, you're definitely going to feel the bumps. And I would say if you're that person, this cube has pretty strong magnets. So hopefully that explains why people can't seem to agree on whether this cube has strong or weak magnets. Regardless, the GuHong version 4 is a really, really fantastic cube, and if you have $15, I recommend buying this wholeheartedly. In fact, I love this cube so much that in this video I will be giving away 2 of them. All you have to do is leave a comment and I'll pick the winners in around a week. Thanks for watching, and until next time, toodles.
All the pieces feel the same, don't they?